Slinn. I'm the Director for Inclusion and Skills in Children's Services. I'm joined today by my colleagues Claudia and also Erin. Erin, I don't know, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. My name's Erin. I am a programme manager within Children's Services. I work closely with Hero on our SEND Priority Action and Improvement Plan. Lovely to be here today.
Thanks, Erin. Erin's going to help me by taking us through some slides today. So just going to pop those on the screen. So thank you for joining us. Hopefully you've seen the sort of advertisement for this and or through word of mouth or other opportunities around this session, but we thought it's really important to come out and talk to you really about this and also kind of think about different ways that we can start to kind of work with you more effectively going forward. But this is very much focusing on our statutory responsibilities in relation to EHCP duties and how we are on a journey really in terms of improvement, in terms of delivery of those and where we are with that, so that you are sort of fully informed of that, you know, in terms of where we are with our improvements. So thank you so much for joining this evening. It is being recorded as well, so then others can access it afterwards, which hopefully will be beneficial because we recognise not everybody would have been able to join us this evening. So thank you. Okay, so this is part of the first of a programme of webinars and other kind of engagement work with parents and carers that we'd like to do. We're focusing this first one around how we're delivering our EHCP duties, and we're doing this because we know and we have heard from you and we know that this is an area of significant concern and therefore is a top priority for us. We're also sharing updates on the local offer. And you can also subscribe to Send News, and there'll be a link at the end of this presentation in terms of how to do that so that you're regularly sort of kept up to date with both this programme and other improvement works, but also opportunities for you to provide feedback so that we're getting those improvements right, or where we still need to kind of work on those going forward. So our next webinar will focus on the topic of specialist provision, which we know is also it's an absolute critical area for improvement for us, and we're doing an awful lot of work in that space, and further details will follow in relation to that. And the webinars will follow those topics that we have been told via surveys and the work that we're doing linked to our priority action improvement plan are kind of the top priorities for us to focus on. So specialist provision next, and this one will focus on our delivery of our statutory SEND duties in relation to education, health and care plans. So what will these slides do today, and this time that we've got together today do? They'll provide that information on our specific programme. We've called it the Making Send Everyone's Business programme, and that's because Making Send Everyone's Business is in our SEND strategy. It's been in our SEND strategy since 2022. And it's how we're bringing that to life as a council in particular in terms of the delivery of those EHCP duties and ultimately what that means for you and your child or your young person. We have received some specific questions ahead of time, so thank you to those parents that have sent those through so that we can explicitly sort of answer those. We hadn't opened the sort of chat function and the hands etc today just because we weren't sure how many people would join, given that this is the first one, and I didn't really want to be sort of in a situation where we couldn't answer some of those key questions or answered some and not others. So thank you, as I say, those who've provided those ahead of time, and then we can kind of, you know, think about different ways and take feedback on different ways to do that in the future to enable that those questions that you may have to be answered really, but hopefully we'll cover them in today's presentation. So what does the Making Send Everyone's Business mean, and what's the background to it, and why are we doing it? So we know there's been a significant rise in requests for EHC needs assessment, and that obviously goes hand in hand with that significant rise in need that we're seeing across the piece, particularly in the areas of communication, interaction needs and linked to sort of an autistic profile, and the areas of social emotional and mental health needs as well. But across the board, we're seeing those increases. And we recognise the need to keep up with the pace of growth that we're seeing, and that we haven't been able to do that consistently enough in the past. So that's the main sort of aims of why we're doing this. The other reason, obviously, that goes hand in hand with that, alongside that increase in need and that rise of requests for EHC needs assessments, is as those numbers have gone up, we've not kept up with the pace in terms of delivery on timescale, on communication in particular between services at times, and then obviously with yourselves, with families, and then the impact on the quality of the education, health and care plan, while that capacity to address those numbers hasn't been where it should be. So I've been in post for just over 18 months now, and one of the key things I did when I first started is to kind of do an analysis of where we are against those statutory SEND duties delivery, what sort of people are telling us in terms of feedback and experience and outcomes, but also obviously looking internally at the kind of the capacity and what the structures and things that we've got in place. And we put together a business case that went through to our council leaders, and that subsequent, sort of in early sort of spring 23, and subsequent to that, we had agreement in July 23 for an additional ongoing 5 million in additional investment into the delivery of statutory SEND services, which was more than the original budget was in the first place. So a real significant increase, and that's ongoing funding, so it's not a sort of one-off piece of resource. Coincidentally, at the same time, we had that visit from Ofsted in June and July. And I say coincidentally because I think because the dates are the same, it can seem like this happened at the same time, but actually the case had to go in many months before it was agreed by Cabinet on the 10th of July. And at that same time, the Ofsted and CQC visit was happening. And that very much reaffirmed the priority areas that we had set out within our strategy, but told us that historically we had not addressed as though at the pace required. So we had not kept up with that increase in need that we're all seeing and feeling and knowing coming through. So we absolutely knew what we needed to address. We needed to address it more quickly, and that investment was integral to us being able to do that. And then post the area inspection, we asked for additional resource again, and a further 2 million was secured per year that's come into play this financial year, so into the sort of 24-25 financial year, and that's across SEND and inclusion actually, because we have new statutory attendance duties coming into play in August around the attendance of children in school, so that's partly to address some capacity in that area and sort of children that aren't attending school, but also some around the statutory SEND duties explicitly as well. So what was the aims of the programme? So the original aim, with the original 5 million, was to recruit between 80 and 90 staff. With the additional 2, to make that total of 7, we were looking to recruit up to 140 new staff. And the aim was to improve timeliness and quality around the education, health and care plan, within the education, health and care plan, but also that quality of kind of casework and working in terms of seeking placement and communication and all of those different aspects that are related to the EHC coordinator role that supports around the delivery of statutory SEND duties. We had an aim to have a more joined up approach across services. So the situation previously, prior to this investment, was that we had one statutory SEND team that delivered all of those statutory duties, 0 to 25 in relation to EHCPs. That's the creation, the assessment, and then the review of those. Even if, and I'm sure you will know, you can appreciate the needs and requirement that's very young with a person aged 22 is quite different from those age 3, let alone the different levels of need, different types of need, different complexities of need that a young person or a child might have. So It's very much about looking at the overall numbers, which we're now up to 12,500 children and young people in Hertfordshire that have education, health and care plans. So a significant number. And thinking about the best way to deliver that in a way that would access the most specialist sort of insight and knowledge, whether that was in relation to a particular need or a particular age and stage. And I'll elaborate a bit more on that in a moment. And then that final one was really important one for everyone, because you will, if you've had experience with the service historically, you will recognise that there's been a high turnover of staff historically in that service, and that the retention has been really difficult, therefore, as well as the recruitment actually, but the retention in particular. And so we want to make sure that we're enabling our staff to do a good job, and to do the work that they need to be able to do, and that they then want to stay, so they have greater job satisfaction. So what does that look like now then in this sort of transformation period? So where we previously had one team that was dealing, as I said, 0 to 25 for all things statutory send, 12,500 children and people. We now have the equivalent of, well, I suppose it's 6 teams if we include the EHC needs assessment side of things as well. So if you are starting out on that journey and your request for EHC needs assessment has come in through our door visual on there, the send front door, then that request is taken forward by the EHC needs assessment team, that service, and they will take you through that 20-week process. Once that 20 weeks is completed and the EHC plan should be issued when it is on time, which is, I can talk a bit more about where we are in that respect in a moment, then that goes out to one of those teams that you see there. So if the child is aged between 0 and 5, it will go to the early years team. And that's one of the teams that will also get more involved. It's the only team really that gets more involved with the assessment, given their specialism around early years and the increased numbers that we're seeing obviously coming through the early years, those younger children needing that EHC plan support. If your child is in school and it is, I should probably say 5 to 16, so obviously when they're actually in school in reception year, then they're supported by the school age statutory send team. And if they are out of school, so they don't have that protection of school, but they are of school age, so that could be a child that's completely missing from education, and you will know that nationally those numbers have risen, and some of you may have experienced that as well, then that team will be much smaller. So it will be within our access and inclusion team, because we recognise that protection that the school offers in terms of being able to, for example, hold the annual review and be your key points of contact as the SENCO in the school doesn't exist if your child is out of school. And that includes for those children that are being electively home educated or accessing education otherwise than at school. So those smaller teams exist within the access and inclusion service for those smaller numbers of children who require that more sort of nuanced approach, and there's increased work really required with families, etc., to make sure that we're getting the right provision in place going forward. And it may be elective home education, that's absolutely the right provision, but it just gives you that point of contact that's more nuanced when you're out of school. And similarly for those children who are looked after, who are in our care as a local authority, don't have that protection from parents in the same way that many of you on the call will offer. It's important that we have those smaller numbers that those staff are supporting, so they can give them that protection, because they may have multiple care placement moves, for example, and move to different places around the country, and we need to make sure that their EHCP is up to date and that they're able to get into those schools quickly, so it doesn't affect their care placement as well. So it's that nuanced approach around the vulnerabilities, additional vulnerabilities, because we recognise, that all these children have complex needs, but it's to try and a nuanced approach to those additional circumstances that they may have. and also expertise. So the virtual school do a superb job. They're a good example of this, working with our children in care anyway. And historically, they would do everything for our children in care education-wise, apart from the EHC plan element. That would be held by the statutory SEND service, and that in itself could create some delay historically, whereas having it joined up means that one team, one service do everything education around that school, and they know those children incredibly well. So it's just joining that expertise up in one area. Services for young people similarly do some excellent work with sort of older young people in school, but also post 16 that are in further education and traineeships and apprenticeships. So going forward, they will be supporting all those young people with EHCPs age 16 plus who are in further education. So, accessing a college course or traineeships or apprenticeships. So the majority of children, and we'll get to that in a moment, will sit in that school age or services, and children and young people will sit in that school age or services for young people cohorts. And I'll talk a bit more about how the communication services will work there slightly differently. But that kind of gives you an overview of the structure and what we mean by making SEND everyone's business. It's about spreading that accountability and responsibility across the directorate, given the increase in numbers that we've seen, and therefore, the need to do something different, to do it differently, and to increase that accountability and that knowledge in relation to SEND and the legislation and what's right for our children and young people across the board, rather than it all being held in one place. Underpinning all of that and goes alongside is our quality assurance, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So what does this actually mean for you? So obviously the EHCP process itself won't change in the sense of it's set in legislation, is what we mean. But what we expect is to see that running more smoothly. So we will be meeting our timescales more frequently, as much as we possibly can. And again, we will be improving that quality of the EHCP document in itself, but also then the subsequent experience. So, children are able to achieve in school, have the right provision in place, schools are able to deliver that provision, and you have increased confidence in that over time, because we do recognise we're starting from quite a low base, particularly in relation to annual reviews. So this is going to be something that's felt incrementally over time, but that is the aim in terms of having those specialist teams working on that. Not to underplay it, but I'm careful not to overpromise either. We have some exceptionally motivated and committed teams across the board that really want to get this right, and they're absolutely, out there jumping at the bit trying to deliver it already. But we want to be measured in that approach in terms of managing expectations and how we want to work to improve. We're on that journey, which we recognise and want to kind of share with you. And then that improved communication as well, which I can talk a bit more about a bit later on. The second box on your screen on the right is trying to explain that nuance of difference again. So if your child is enrolled with a school, your SENCO and whoever the relevant school staff, because I recognise it works differently in different schools. And my background is I was a SENCO myself for several years in schools and done various roles in schools, and so I recognise it works differently depending on the school. But that key contact will be in school in terms of delivering your child's EHCP with you. And our new model will further facilitate and empower and enable that key relationship. Really is our aim. So schools and educational settings, so the colleges and the schools will have an allocated EHC coordinator. That information is already on the local offer, but staff are onboarding at the moment over the course of this term, so that will change over the course of this term, but that will be allocated to that school or college, and that regular sort of communication will happen between sort of the school or college and us, the local authority, those officers. The more tailored involvement comes, and I said these 2 points already, when a child is perhaps not at school or is in our care, and we've focused on those already, I've described that, but also those transition phases, so moving from primary to secondary, starting school for the first time, transitioning to college, or those significant times when actually we can't wait for an annual review. There's been a significant change of need of the child and the provision required. We need to hold those called them emergency reviews, but actually they're in the those interim reviews to look at the needs and provision at that time, and they will give additional advice to schools and colleges at that time it's needed. But also they, absolutely, you could also contact that EHC coordinator should your school not be able to provide the relevant information in the first instance. We recognise it hasn't run like that historically in a consistent enough way. And so then there has been that need sometimes for schools and parents to feel like they're chasing their EHC coordinator, the SEN officer, or the local authority generally for answers. But the aim through the programme is to make sure that relationship with our schools and colleges is much stronger, so they are able to support and sort of take you through that journey, and that we then would give that additional support in those circumstances when it's most required. So where are we with the programme? Because some of you may, it's really, I'm unsure whether or not, but we held a recruitment event in September, an open recruitment event, and we had over 120 people that came to that. So after that resource was agreed, and it was a wonderful event. And I know I'm saying some of you may have been there because we completely went out asking for people who had transferable skills and lived experience, because of course the first challenge that was put to me was like, okay, Hero, you've got this significant amount of funding, how are you going to recruit? And if I give you an example, when we went out to advert for EHC Coordinator before the September recruitment event and the whole kind of turning it on its head in terms of opening up that pool for us to be able to recruit from, we had 5 applications, and we interviewed 3 people, and nobody was suitable against the criteria that had been set previously. So obviously knowing that and thinking we've now got to recruit, at the time it was between 80 and 90 additional staff, most of them being EHC coordinators, although there were some different roles, which I'll talk about in a moment, was obviously a daunting task, a big task, but one that we absolutely were committed to do. And we held that recruitment event and we said, look, we are not asking for finished article. You don't have to have come with extensive work experience in X, Y, or Z. What we're looking for is almost those bits that you can't train. And as a teacher, I know when I used to mentor teachers through this, it's that building that relationship with children with something you either had it or you didn't. It was quite difficult to kind of see teachers come through who couldn't do that. That was a really essential part, and we went in on that idea. So it's those transferable skills and lived experience, and that absolutely could be lived experience as a parent, as an adult with SEND, as somebody who'd worked in SEND for a long time. It's that broadest sense of lived experience, because we recognise that passion and commitment and intrinsic motivation comes from people who have that lived experience alongside those transferable skills, and it just does. I can give you countless examples. I'll give you one of the best EHC coordinators I've ever recruited, not through this programme but in a previous local authority, but I will be using examples from this programme going forward as I start to get to know the new staff as they come on board. But in previous role was a chap that was ex RAF. So he had no background and experience in education, local authority, health, social care whatsoever. But he was a parent of a child with additional needs who attended one of the local special schools at the time. So there was nothing he didn't know about SEN legislation. There was nothing he didn't know about that, how it actually feels, how it really feels. And of course, he had the transferable skills from his professionalism as in his position in the RAF previously. So he was an exceptional officer. And I think it was on those basis, in terms of that's what we want. We want people that have got that intrinsic motivation to really make a difference, to come and work with us, because, you know, that's certainly where many of us come from in terms of getting into this work in the first place. So I'm really pleased to report that it was an incredibly successful recruitment campaign. The advert went out towards the end of September. Up until sort of February, over the course of that time, we received over 900 applications, which was just amazing. It far exceeded our expectations. I think we've conducted over 300 interviews over the course of this time, and it's been really difficult because there is that lag. We got the resource, we do it, we know that we're trying to work as hard as we possibly can to get people on board, but of course for you, you're thinking, well, hang on a minute, what's happening, what's making the difference? But all of these things have to be followed in order to kind of onboard those new staff. But through that, we have now appointed 112 staff. In order to do that, we recognise, you know, with that intrinsic motivation, those transferable skills, there was of course the need for a proper training and induction programme. We couldn't just say, as we would have done historically, if people come with vast experience working for local authority SEND teams, that you could sort of hit the ground running. They're going to need that training and induction. So we designed a programme of study called our Hertfordshire SEND Academy. And that's an innovative piece of work. You know, nowhere else in the country, I believe, is designed one. I'm constantly being asked to give information in relation to it. There are organisations such as Mason, who we worked closely with, that offer training and really good support for sort of SEN officers or EHC coordinators. But there isn't an authority that's kind of taken those bits of good practice and then delivered it in this way. So it's a protected programme where staff do not sort of work directly, do any of their role. They're just experiencing that training, which includes shadowing and some visits out to schools and other experiences, including talks from parents as part of that induction programme. It's really important. And we've had 70 staff graduate who come out of the academy so far and into the teams that we described, and we've got 12 that are currently in the programme. Our aim was to have everybody out of the programme over the course of this term, so between April and July. However, we've had to take one cohort, I believe, is going to join us in September, just because of notice periods of when different people have joined, etc. So there will be that one further cohort. We have fully recruited to a new quality assurance service. There's more details on that coming in a moment, and we've got really clear plans underway to regularly measure and report on the progress data. So part of that work, as people have come on board, has been to kind of clear things that were out of timescale previously. A really good example of that is our EHC needs assessments. So we had a number that were out of timescale previously, and we've issued almost 400 over the course of March, which is more than ever before, to make sure that as new teams come aboard, given that sort of plan around that they can then come and have that reasonable number that they're supporting, and therefore offer a quality service going forward in that team. So that's just one example of some of the work we've been doing. Okay, so this is just another kind of table really that describes that nuanced approach and what that will actually look like and feel like. So you will notice straight away that those numbers for the school age SEND and services for young people are significantly higher than the others, but significant lower than they were. So that school age SEND, as I said, was a SEND service 0 to 25. So in that first column, you'll see the range of numbers of children and young people with EHCPs that were allocated to those teams was significant. And that team consisted historically of 20 EHC coordinators. That's what we had in September. supported children, 11,500 children and people with EHC plans. So I'm sure any whizzy mathematicians on the call can work that out, but that just wasn't a doable job, really, in terms of being able to deliver on that consistently. And as a result, we've had very high turnover, sort of high levels of complaint and so on coming in, and rightly so. And that meant that even fewer were actually working in that time. So although those numbers are still high, I'm not saying it's a perfect situation. They've come down significantly compared to what they were. And that's why that nuanced approach is really important, and something I really was keen to get across to you today. That for those two services in particular, it's about how they work with their settings, most importantly the schools and the further education settings, unless there's a significant issue and reason for that not to be the case. But where that protection isn't in place, because there's not school, it's not the family support, as in they don't, we are the corporate parent, or we're undergoing an assessment initially, those numbers are smaller because it's recognised that that is that sort of start of this journey, and it's important therefore that that communication directly with families is in place, thinking about the assessment team. That just gives you an overview of where we are in terms of putting that in place now. And all those staff will come on board by that September point. So hopefully that was a bit of a whistle stop off the programme. I now get on to the questions that you'd asked us to answer beforehand. As I said, I'm incredibly grateful for you sending these through so that we can make sure this is tailored according to what you need and what you find most beneficial. So the first one here, plus two, I'll say them both, was asking us how we will make sure all the new recruits are highly skilled to manage EHCPs and deliver them according to statutory law. Really important question. And then how will we retain new staff? Will any of this make a difference if turnover of staff remains high? Both great questions, which I hope I've partly answered already, but wanted to provide a really clear kind of answer to that. So this is based on the principles of our Hertfordshire SEND Academy. So it is about a high quality induction, but also an ongoing training programme, which is really important. So it's not just have your induction and then off you go. It's ongoing training that's provided. We've done that in collaboration with NASON and with other organisations with high experience. Our Parent Care Forum, HVCI, delivers specific modules, particularly around empathetic communication and how we work with other professionals and families to that staff. And that is part of an ongoing training programme. It's not just a one-off, although that protected time at the beginning is really important in terms of impacting on both of those questions, actually. The retention, very, very important, and also making sure what they're doing is in line with the law, exactly right, with the legislation. And that focuses in on those priorities of the quality and timeliness of EHCPs, how and when we are communicating and working with families, with schools, with other educational settings. And that working culture as well is really, really important around that. So making sure we've got a really strong culture between all of our teams. As I mentioned, some of our teams are established and work with young people regularly already, such as Services for Young People or our virtual school, which obviously works with our looked after children. It's a very established service. So it's about them joining those cultures, if you like, within those services. But some of them are almost brand new because of that turnover that you've rightly described. It's certainly the school age statutory SEND service. We've got a new head of that service, Alistair Hines, who joined us at the end of February, and he's really building an entire team and building that culture straight away. There are some existing staff, but the majority will be new staff. So it's starting from that. We've also really thought about the professionalism of the workforce. So it's not just kind of saying it's really important that that bottom bullet point there about the whole recruitment programme being based on values, transferable skills and experience, so that intrinsic motivation, really important. But actually giving those steps to the next level, if you think about a teacher professional, social work professional or others, they have that. It's really clear, and that ongoing professional development is nationally recognised and accredited, and that really is the way it should go, sort of as a national recognition for the work of EHC coordinators, because it can be incredibly kind of complex, varied, working with lots of different agencies, working with lots of different families and young people in lots of different circumstances. So we are, as I say, working with NACEN around those BTEC qualifications as part of the progression as well that we're offering, and right up into sort of management as well. I'm just having a quick look. Yes, and in order to kind of evaluate the impact and effectiveness of this, we are working with the University of Hertfordshire as well to carry out an independent evaluation at the right point on our journey of the effectiveness of the SEND Academy. And if it is answering, we'll include those questions actually in that review. You know, is it answering those questions? Is it doing what it needs to do? Or are there other bits that we need to introduce into it to make it more compliant with those questions? But they're absolutely the bits that we're measuring too. So I'm really pleased to see those questions there today. In terms of how we're going to improve the quality of EHCP, so I mentioned it briefly earlier, but it's important to say those 138 roles aren't all EHC coordinators, although the majority are, and sort of the supporting administrative officers around those officers too. So it's very much about that frontline, if you like, service delivery, which we've heard from parent survey that I hope many of you have contributed into, the HBCI, the Parent Care Forum in Hertfordshire run. That has been fed into us clear and loud that this is the area that most needs to improve, and so this is where we are absolutely focusing much of our energy, and part of that has been to create some other roles around them. So two examples I'll give, and the question I know is specifically about quality, but one is to create 4 new SEND panel managers, which we didn't have before. So previously the sort of provision panel elements were chaired by people who also were managing the statutory SEND service, and that contributed sometimes to the delay. But we've now put extra resource in that, and our next webinar, as we said, will focus on specialist provision, will include some updates in terms of how we're increasing the capacity around that area, and therefore making swifter decisions in relation to that going forward. Now we've got those 4 panel managers, and we've also expanded our SEND quality assurance function as well. One of the things, and it was a blessing certainly when I joined Hertfordshire to come into, is within a few months we were rated as outstanding in our children's services social care, and it's the first authority I've ever worked in that does have an outstanding children's social care, and it's enabled me to really learn from that good practice and see where that great practice is in place. And not just me, you know, all of us kind of working in children's services, we're working as one really, and learning from each other. And they have a very effective quality assurance service for social care that sits outside of the sort of service delivery, so with the people who are on the ground, the workforce, and acts as that, I suppose, yes, the support and challenge, that critical bit when we need to make sure that things are testing us and improved and coming into the service, but also, you know, encouraging staff, giving them that feedback, positive feedback when things are going well, and improving that practice. And it works incredibly well in Hertfordshire. It's an established mechanism in lots of children's services for social care, and yet for SEND it's developing in a lot of areas. So we were really keen to say we want it to match that, we want it there. So we have got a SEND quality assurance team that sits outside of my directorate, and it very much works alongside that social care quality assurance service, so that they're running that same service basically, so they're following the same working practices, that same culture in terms of that rigour of kind of it. In this case, we have a significant improvements to make, which wasn't the same position as social care, although it was back in, it was 2009, children's social care in Hertfordshire requires improvement. So they've obviously been on a journey as well, and we've been on a journey in regards to our social care, and they've learnt and developed what not just what good looks like, what outstanding looks like. So we're trying to model in the same way and have that same oversight. So we have a dedicated focus team. They are increasing their auditing work across SEND, and we're using a tool that it's designed by an organisation called Envision 360. That's their chief executive is an ex-educational psychologist, and that organisation, that company is working with a third of local authorities in the country, because one of the challenges we're up against is that, apart from obviously what's in the code of practice, which absolutely must be adhered to, there isn't that very clear template of exactly what good looks like nationally. So it's then working to have a clear auditing system that looks at all of those sections of the EHCP, the experience of the EHCP, and then is able to audit and identify those specific areas for improvement, and then put targeted kind of work, training, support in for those areas that need to improve. We've also got two new practice development leads that play a really important role in enforcing that learning from the audit. So once we've done them, how are we building that into working practice and having people that it is their role to do that and to make sure that that's happening. And of course, as I mentioned, deliver training, but also celebrate the good practice as well as be clear on the areas that we need to work on. We're starting from a low baseline on this. We absolutely recognise that. So when we first used this tool about 6 months ago to do that baseline work, once we'd started to get those new capacity on board, we were coming in below sort of 10% being audited as good or better, which, you know, from the sample that was used, which obviously is not where we want to be. That has already increased by almost 20% in terms of that auditing within that 6 months of those being audited as good or better, which we're pleased with. Not where we want to be, we continue. And the target we've got in our improvement plan is to say 40% by sort of spring 25 next year will be audited as good or better from the sample. People often, a couple of times people have said to me, is that ambitious enough here for where you need to be? No, this is not where we want to be ultimately, but for that time frame, that is the right place and to be measured and to manage those expectations. You know, we don't have a magic wand, but we want to strive to get it better each time, and that's how we're planning to do that. And we're absolutely committed and have the right systems and people in place to drive that forward at pace. But that will be the pace. And I think it's important to say that also through that tool, we were able to benchmark against other local authorities, which is why we use that, and sort of the national average from the third of local is being used is around that 40% as well. So that are the right place for that spring 25, given the national context, but that we keep going past that point because, you know, we're driven to do so. We want to do so within the context that we're working in because we're committed to getting this right for our children and young people. Okay, so how will communication improve? So obviously we have more officers, there's more time for that communication. People are able to do that. We're working on that culture, so making sure that that's at the forefront of people's minds. So we've got something called our ACT guidance that's been developed by our Parent Carer Forum and forms part of our communications plan. And that ACT stands for accurate, compassionate and timely. And that's driven through that training that we're delivering to our staff to make sure that that's absolutely at the forefront, focusing on that operational detail, response times, escalations, and some of that standard messaging throughout, particularly the EHC needs assessment process, but also the other times. As I've said, for reviews when there are existing EHCPs in place and the child is in schools or in colleges, then there's that that communication with the school and college to enable and empower those conversations that you have with somebody that you've got a really good relationship with. And then there's that different level of communication depending on the children's circumstance. But again, following that same principle of accurate, compassionate time is what we're trying to roll out as we work with both families and other professionals going forward. And that's that culture shift, but also now we have the capacity to really deliver on a consistent culture. We're not setting people up to fail, really, not be able to deliver. Monitoring. Oh, sorry, it's because I paused. Oh, sorry, Erin. Yeah, no, I think I had finished on that slide. So I think you were right. Sorry, I thought there was one other thing, but there actually isn't. Thank you. So how will this time be different? When will I feel the improvements, and how do we know it will work? Really important questions, and thank you for asking those. I think the biggest challenge that certainly I faced and we face as a leadership team is knowing that in the past, I think many have been told that things will get better and then haven't felt that, and that sits heavy with me, even though wasn't necessarily here for that previous time. But I think, gosh, if I was a parent in that circumstance and that's been my experience on top of the experience I already have to sort of deal with and to work with, that's really challenging. And why would you have the trust that you know, things are going to be different? And that's what I hope I've tried to be really measured in today's webinar, and to not say, oh, in 6 months everything's going to be absolutely you know, wonderful in every aspect. We are on a journey. We're on an improvement journey. We've published our improvement plan. We're really clear about the bits we can do and the bits that we are going to be on a journey to doing. But equally, we're really excited, and we're really about our new staff joining. You know, they're absolutely the right people to be delivering on this, and we're really committed to doing that. And I hope that comes across too, in terms of where we want to be compared to where we have been. So the first thing to say is this is ongoing investment. This isn't a small amount for a period of time, which I know historically has happened, or perhaps not enough, you know, in terms of nowhere near the level that we've been awarded by our councillors. It's ongoing significant investment every year, so that we can have permanent workforce addressing statutory SEND duties. All services with more staff are enabled to do that high quality work. We had some incredibly committed people before this investment who are still with us, and even those that have left also were in a lot of cases very exceptional. So it wasn't a case of those people couldn't do, they weren't enabled to, they weren't given the tools to, they weren't given the capacity to do that consistently enough, given the numbers and how many we'd seen in terms of increases, which of course is a national issue, but for Hertfordshire, we'd seen a really significant rate of increase that we've just not been able to keep up with in terms of those numbers. So we're enabling our staff, which in turn should translate to better outcomes for our children and people. And we're continuously monitoring and scrutinising across the board through our sort of education, learning and lifelong libraries panel. There's real scrutiny from cross-party members. There's scrutiny within our multi-agency improvement groups, which we have parent representation on each of those groups around those key improvement areas, to give us that challenge when we need it, if things are slipping, or actually support when, do you know what, that is making a difference, or do you know what, this isn't making a difference, you need to do it differently. And again, we're bringing in young people more consistently than we were previously at both that strategic level, that operational level, that individual level. So we're hearing their voice as well at each point to just tell us whether this is the priority, this is the bit we need to be focusing on, if we need to tweak that. And this whole programme came from the parental feedback we received in particular, and obviously our own analysis, but very much so from that point feedback around improvements in this area was heard loud and clear. And then the measures of experience. So it's that bit about how do we know it will work, and we're constantly having that conversation about, you know, the so what, the impact, how are we going to know that it's making a difference? And that's us asking, you know, having measures around that act. Now there'll be automated responses that go out systematically, probably from September, but we'll start to roll that out kind of at a phased approach from June, July onwards, where there's a sort of survey that can be completed around that accurate, compassionate and timely. We're measuring our compliments, our complaints that have come in as well, and kind of the trajectory of that, which is an improving trajectory, but we're keeping that scrutiny on that as the new staff come on board to really be able to see that. And then we want to share that with you as well and say, you know, actually, you know, this is our evidence that things hopefully are getting better, so you can see it, and you then can hopefully, particularly if you've had a particularly bad experience in the past, can start to feel like, oh, okay, maybe some things are different. And also for new people coming in, I think it can be quite daunting, you know, they hear that, oh gosh, things been really difficult in Hertfordshire for SEND, what's this going to be like for me, what's it going to be like for my child? So the more we can measure that experience in particular and those outcomes for our young people and communicate that out, the better. So we're actually recruiting a SEND engagement partnerships manager to really drive that forward, so that we are able to feed that back to you in terms of how we know it will work. You will tell us, and we want to give you greater opportunities to tell us, really. Okay, so I think all that's left for me to say is a big thank you for your attendance this afternoon. We greatly appreciate it. There are places on the local offer where you can provide your feedback, which we'd welcome. And as I say, we're thinking mostly about how we sort of engage as more staff come on board. So that we are working more closely with our families going forward. So always open to ideas around that. There's opportunity as well for you to follow us on Facebook, where we're putting out more details around that once we sort of, you know, through our parent care reform, particularly have some feedback in terms of how we share updates and so on, and engage with you in the future. And also you have the opportunity to subscribe to our SEND news, which the link is there for you to be able to access as well. So thank you all so much for your time this evening, which I know is precious. I really appreciate it, and I hope you've found it beneficial. Thank you.